It's now my pleasure to introduce somebody who has already quite introduced himself, Peter Fonagy. It's a bit strange to introduce Peter at an MBT presentation. Of course, everybody knows Peter. I'm sure everybody knows that he's also the CEO of the Anna Freud Center, that he's also a professor or or invited professor at Harvard, at Yale, in addition, of course, to University College of London. I'm not sure people know how much Geneva owes Peter something about MBT. Many years ago, when the sort of MBT initiative started here in Geneva, thanks to Martin and a whole group of beginners, Peter has immediately accepted to support us in a very genuine and generous way. And I think, Peter, this is the result, not even 6 or 7 years later. So thank you so much for you being here and for your generosity.
Thank you, sir. I try, it's a very generous introduction in terms I was trying to live up to some parts of it, but I'm sure that I'll fail. The current talk, actually, I hope will connect to what David had talked about. It's my hope that it will. But this is a projection.
At the beginning of
Indeed. So let's go for that. So if you move on the slides, that's my email address. The talk itself is Patrick Luyten's, Liz Allison's, mine with support from Nico Manzini. So just before I start, just a few things that I feel really proud of. This is, of course, the Mentalizing Mafia, many of whom are sitting in the audience, and the particular individuals who have influenced this particular talk, Anthony Bateman, Patrick Luyten, Liz Allison, I'll pull out. But there are many others, as I said, I'm very proud to have these individuals, not just as colleagues, but also as friends, and it has been one of the great joys of my own career, my own life, that I had the opportunity of working with such a talented group, including colleagues from America as well. Now, this is the slide I like showing. The article published something big as well, mentalizing or mentalization, and you see the exponential growth of this construct over the years, and it's obviously not in any sense due to just our own efforts, but it's good to feel that we are pushing something that has quite a lot of general approval. Now, I feel particularly proud, of course, being from the Anna Freud Center, because Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Cambridge visited the Anna Freud Center on the 17th of September 2015. Unfortunately, the discourse wasn't in the media that followed wasn't entirely to do with developmental psychopathology. Kate Middleton in Baltimore and dressed to resume the roller duties after Princess Charlotte's death, Daily Mail. And Duchess of Cambridge shows off new fringe and first sole engagement since the birth of Charlotte. Then Kate Middleton returns to work with a bang, breaking hair news. You see this theme is maintained because Her Royal Highness honoured the Anna Freud Center with a pre-Christmas visit, which again led to wonderful media coverage from the Daily Mirror, from the Eye, from the Sun, Telegraph, Times, the Guardian, because the intellectual paper was the only one that didn't acknowledge this significant event. But we were all really very sad because should have still been mention of mentalization. Especially, and yet again, the theme returned of Pete Middleton brought to life of festivals of interest. Christmas party, which is Pete Middleton's festive in the beautiful bright red outfit by Alexander McQueen. And then, that was the hairstyle as well. Royal News, Pete Middleton insists on a hairstyle despite Queen Elizabeth's demand for shorter haircuts today. Now there's one mention that was closer to our heart. Pete Middleton's vision in red as she attends Children's Mental Health Centre Christmas party. We were really very pleased about it in the book. The Duchess of Cambridge visits the Anna Freud Centre charity in London. Unfortunately, immediately below this announcement was another announcement that you could click on to get to bad hair. You wouldn't laugh quite so much. But Kate Middleton is really a wonderful person, and she has a genuine interest in our work. And in the Huffington Post coming up, there will be a special issue on children's mental health that she's editing. So her interest in child mental health is very, very genuine, and this is actually quite wonderful. This is the MBT, the new book, Mentalization-Based Treatment for Personality Disorders, and I'm really very proud to say that there is actually a French version of the 2000, the most recent version of mentalization in this very big which is, I hope, on sale. I'm just holding this up for a while. My arm gets tired. Anyway, so it's just that I'm a little bit disoriented because MBT is in French has to be obviously read in reverse, read backwards, as TBM, as Bas sur la mentalisation. And so inversion of sorry about that. Okay, so the nature of I'm not going to even attempt to finish my talk. I'll just start it. I'm going to try and talk about is borderline personality disorder from a developmental perspective, which brings forth, I think, the kind of common ground between neuroscience of resilience and the current phenomenological work in borderline personality disorder, where I believe that mentalization can be a bridge. I'm going to focus on just two attempts at reimagining the nature of personality disorder in phenomenological discourse, as in DSM. And I won't spend too much time on it, except to show the struggle that psychiatry is having with notions such as personality disorder. Anyway, in section 3, which is in the further research section for personality disorder in DSM-5, DSM-5 is exactly the same as DSM-4 for the main part, but there is this section where personality disorder is defined as impairments in the self and difficulties in relatedness, and combines a kind of dimensional and a categorical approach. It maintains the kind of historical caution to attribute personality disorders to adolescents. It only can do it under relatively unusual circumstances. But there are 4 criteria that defines personality disorder, and then a set of 4 or more specific attributes that touch on and enable you to identify severity and typology. ICD-11 has legitimized diagnosis, early diagnosis, but we will we'll try and see if it's a real progress. So in section 3 of DSM-5, there is a notion of level of personality functioning, where categories of the self, particularly to do with identity and self-directedness, and categories of interpersonal functioning, particularly to do with empathy and intimacy, find place. Severity is more than one of a number of typological PD diagnoses that include our old friends: antisocial, avoidant, borderline, narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive type, and so on. Narcissistic had a narrow escape. We nearly lost narcissistic personality disorder. Can you imagine the world of psychiatry without narcissistic personality disorder? No, I didn't mean psychiatrists. Sorry about that. Very poor joke. But because it's by a committee, there were also those who do not believe in kind of typology and had 25 trait facets grouped under 5 domains, which I don't really want to go into, based on the big 5 questionnaire studies of personality. The more interesting for us, from a mentalizing perspective, is really how much the phenomenology of personality disorder per se maps onto the things that we are interested in mentalizing. Identity, particularly self-image that's poorly developed, emptiness, dissociative states, self-direction, goals and values, empathy, and the absence of a capacity to recognize the needs of others and feelings of others, and instability of relationships and the characteristic of mistrust and over-involvement in particular. So from our point of view, there are major strengths in this approach, particularly its dimensional nature and also severity, which is a functional scale that's engaged in that, which is a good predictor of long-term outcome. However, if you have to think about personality disorder as being developed, as being based on 25 facets or 5 domains, it's not practical. Its clinical utility will be very limited. And also, from our point of view, I don't think we like the title categorization, particularly having both types and dimensions. There's a certain incommensurability about it, which we don't have. Well, ICD-11 is, of course, a car crash. And it's very interesting. I mean, it's very interesting. It's totally dimensional. And there's only one personality disorder dimension. But actually, it's an interesting, as car crashes go, it's quite an interesting car crash from our point of view. There is an acknowledgement of experiences that are disturbed about self and others being at the core of personality disorder. The maladaptive patterns of cognition, emotional experience that we have been thinking and writing about in borderline personality disorder are really core to this definition as well. I don't want to go too much into the 5 dimensions that Peter Tyler and colleagues are particularly concerned about, because these are fairly abstract, and they're not necessarily as helpful as they could be. They're very pragmatic, very closely measurable, but make few assumptions. I would want to have underscore that all the domains actually relate to an underlying absence of an underlying capacity, which I think are expression, these are manifestations of. Severity, and that's really quite interesting from our point of view, is a combination. Severity is having lots of different of these domains being involved is how you measure severity. And I think not using typal categorizations from our point of view very important. So the common features of these new classifications to personality disorder are that severity is co-occurrent. Severity is things coming together. The implicit assumption of an underlying dimensional, whatever it is that's missing. That the key to understanding personality disorder is a low psychosocial functioning. That there is a foregrounding of interpersonal problems and the trust in relationships that an individual can have. And that separation of diverse manifestations from some kind of singular underlying clinical vulnerability underpins all these new approaches. And the example of emergent personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, in terms of its comorbidity, is a kind of good illustration that what we see in emergent BPD is a high level of comorbidity of ADHD, oppositional disorder, conduct disorder, lots of externalizing things, as well as substance-related problems and internalizing problems, mood, separation anxiety, social movement. So the majority of adolescents show diagnosable comorbidity if they have borderline personality disorder. And it's at the confluence, the coming together of internalizing and externalizing problems. Disruptive behavior, as alongside depression, is one of the best early indicators of borderline. And this is just some recent figures on the comorbidity that's specific of borderline personality disorder. I want you to, it seems to be specific to borderline personality disorder, having mood, anxiety, and externalizing disorders in combination. And that holds true in factor analytic studies, in complicated factor analytic studies where you combine internalizing problems of panic, social disorder, generalizing anxiety disorder, externalizing problems of ADHD, opposition-defiant disorder, conduct disorder. And beyond that, there is a factor that combines these, which is borderline personality disorder. So there's internalizing, externalizing, and this combined disorder. One of the interesting things that we found was that, in a paper that's under review at the moment, is that attachment, as measured in the child attachment interview, has unique associations with this combination of internalizing, externalizing, that seems to be unique to the individual with the diagnosis. Now, this gets me rather rapidly to how we, once we start looking at personality disorder in the life course, things start looking rather different. Because in phenomenological psychiatry, people have so often looked at the last 6 months to arrive at some kind of model of the structure. Now, it wasn't really until Leahy and Caspi started looking in a bifactor way, in a complex developmental way, at diagnostic categories that persisted between 18, 21, 26, 32 and 38, that something emerged which people were to some degree surprised by. That externalizing problems, yes, okay, alcoholism and conduct disorder are externalizing problems, and that exists at a spectral level. Internalizing problems, general anxiety disorder, fears, exists as an internalizing problem. Thought disorder, schizophrenia, mania, OCD surprisingly exist. But the clarity of these comes in part out of there being an overarching problem that they call factor P. That is something that they all have in common, that all these different diagnoses draw on. Now, what on earth is that? I can tell you. You already are taking a perspective on this. I haven't got halfway through yet. Okay, this is actually a model that came out last year on Dutch adolescents, showing the same, in a longitudinal perspective, the same structure when people were assessed at 10, 13, 16 and 19, various self-reports. This model that assumed internalizing, externalizing and thought disorder gave an inadequate model fit. And once you assumed also this overarching P for psychopathology, that an adequate model fit was arrived at. I'm going to leave some of these. I can't leave this one because this is our study. I have to talk about that. This is internalizing and externalizing, and this time looking at symptom level. So externalizing, I'm calm, this is I'm angry, I fight a lot. Internalizing, I feel scared, I worry a lot, I cry a lot, I'm unhappy. They exist as these spectral level factors, but with clarity, when you also assume all those symptoms load on a general psychopathology factor. And the interesting thing is that this actually makes sense, these bifactors, assuming this overall factor, the P factor, actually makes sense of gender differences more. It's not associated with gender, and it's also makes sense of some of the income differentials. So, for example, internalizing is positively associated with wealth. If you assume a P factor, but P factor, of course, is associated with deprivation. So income deprivation is, it's kind of all these things start suddenly falling into place. Ditto school attainment, but I'll leave that. The important finding is this. The important finding is that when we try and look at the future, when we try on this small sample of 23,000 kids, actually it's only 10,000 that we have time 1 and time 2 data on, followed up, we want to know who our case is 3 years down the line. Then what we see is that if you look at internalizing, it doubles the chance. If you look at externalizing, 4 times the chance. And if you look at the bifactor model, if you assume that there is this factor P, this factor for pathology, kind of being sick as a dog, that doesn't translate into French. Anyway, then internalizing actually is not accounting for much variance. Externalizing predicts the same level, but having this high overall pathology multiplies the likelihood of being a case 10 times over. So P could stand for persistence. If you have a high P score, you're more likely to have a persistent problem. Now, I hope that you are seeing where I'm trying to head to. That persistent is also something that people talk about in relation to personality disorder. What I would like to suggest to you that something like borderline personality disorder is something like the P factor, something that a general vulnerability to psychopathology. And there's this lovely study, Carla Sharp, Manninger, colleagues, tried to show how a 966 patient, how the symptoms, too fast, how the symptoms of BPD actually, symptoms of avoidance, symptoms of obsessive compulsive, etc., cluster into those diagnoses. And they cluster reasonably well. But actually, the model just doesn't fit. This is not the right model for these symptoms. Now, why isn't it the right model? Because all these correlate too highly. If you have one personality disorder, you're likely to have another. So you may have a coherent problem, coherent diagnosis, but actually they are very highly correlated. So what is at symptom level, again, what we see is there's a massive cross-loading between these symptoms. So social anxiety cross-loads, view of self. You can see pretty quickly, as soon as you start looking at individual symptoms, you get a bit of a mess. Can you see that's a mess? Okay. But it isn't. It's actually reasonably clear that there are these factors that fit, that the model fits reasonably well, that actually does yield to you avoidant, obsessive-compulsive, narcissistic, thank God for that, schizotypal, antisocial, one that doesn't make a lot of sense, yields these factors, but actually only if you assume a general factor, and that borderline personality, the symptoms of borderline personality disorder load on their general factor. Am I being clear about this? So what you have is something that, if you have a lot of problems, you've got a persistent problem, something that's actually going to stay with you, and that the categories are less relevant than this overarching persistent problem. This is an excellent model fit, and it's ungendered or partially gendered, and there's increased impairment associated with it. Now, I was going to talk to you about happiness briefly, because we don't talk about happiness enough, and I won't have time to do that, but what I want to say is that what we know is that happiness is not determined by the same factors as unhappiness. It's not simply the upside down of unhappiness. Particularly happiness that's conceived of in terms of the meaning of self-realization, the degree to which a person feels they're fully functioning. The predictors are socially things like democracy and social trust and self-esteem. And don't have enough time to go through the individual studies, but one particular study I like, you'll see in a minute why, is that when you ask people in different countries questions like, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? So whether there is social trust, that actually there is a very close correlation between changes in social trust and measured nationally, and also a sense of happiness. So you can see here across a number of countries that went through a transition. Hungary here is a bit of an outlier. It's the only country where actually social trust decreased throughout this transition. I just want to mention that in passing. But actually there is a change in happiness and life satisfaction increases with the increase in social trust. Now, how does this relate to BPD? But I want to tell my story, a very simple story. I want to think of BPD as a failure of resilience. That understanding of the P or G factor is best in terms of the absence of an expected resilience. So if we start thinking about what is it that a person has, not who is under the microscope who have a particular problem, but what happens when we look at adversity, rather than looking at the person who succumbs after adversity, we start looking at the individual who is actually not the one that has psychopathology, but who is resilient. Maybe we'll come with a better answer to this issue of persistence. That resilience is an active process. It's an active and biological process. Active refers to anything that's resource demanding and maybe cognitive or behavioral resources. But it has been conceptualized in a range of ways, most of which are incredibly confusing, and I have not been able to make a lot of sense of it. I don't have time to allow it to all happen by itself, but there's lots of different ways. But there is a guy called David Rudolph who conceptualized it for the first time in a sensible way, as the ability of a system to resist dynamically a perturbation or adverse condition that challenges the integrity of its normal operation and to preserve function as a result in reference to some initial design or normative functional standard.
That's me.
Yes, that's accurately quoted. I'm pleased. I got that right. So what we are talking about is that there are certain factors that predict resilience, which is an outcome, which is being able to manage with adversity under reasonable conditions. And there is in between some kind of biological or psychological mechanism that David was talking about that may be of particular relevance to us. There are individual factors, but there are also, as I was trying to highlight, systemic social factors that are as really important in determining the positive side of resilience. So what is it then that if you accept the notion that what is the reason that individuals with borderline personality disorder have a persistent problem is because they're not resilient. What is it what's the mechanism of resilience? I think from a mentalizing point of view, we do not need to, we can be quite brave in some of the conclusions that we can come to. That if at the core of this problem is a question of being oversensitive to the possibility of the meaning of different kinds of social interactions, that they cannot interpret the reasons for others' actions accurately. They cannot just set aside, put out of their mind potentially upsetting memories. Then really what we're trying to find is the model that will actually accommodate that. So what really is at the heart of resilience is what I think David is trying to point to, which is really meaning-making. How do we make sense of our world, our social world? Is it a half-empty glass that has things missing in it, or is it half full? But our experience is social, and that is something that I think we really need to take on board in relation to your Lacanian model. That Lacan wasn't so sensitive on. That these are... you can dispute whatever you like. I don't understand Lacan fully, so he tells me what he tells me. that he actually doesn't do it very well is his problem, not mine. Understanding is social, okay? That our experience is with people, that our appraisal is driven by, as David suggests, by top-down cognition. It's not determined by a fixed stimulus response. It is driven by HOC, or higher order cognition. That is the capacity to be able to reorganize mental representations in a manner that actually yields a happier result. And it systematically yields an unhappy result, then you're vulnerable to adverse experiences that happen to all of us. This is the way I would be my theoretical formulation going alongside what David was suggesting. That if there are multiple processing units in the brain, and some are more efficient than others, then output is always taken from the efficient processing unit. But circumstances change, and adaptation may reverse this hierarchy. So the one was once adaptive is no longer so. So what you have in this appraisal system, in this system of higher order cognition, is a capacity to shift processing between units so that the most effective for that social context comes to the fore. So resilience is appropriate appraisal for the particular circumstances that you have found yourself in. It's a developmental capacity based on early relationships, as I think Jerry, amongst others, was so beautifully showing us, and also is totally implicit in a multi-family model that I outlined, where we learn this capacity to reorganize our representation, which then yields, through our interactions with our caregivers, the capacity to withstand adversity, to be able to reorganize our cognitions. So what are the mechanisms? There probably, according to Kalish and colleagues, there are three, and I'm just using these not as definitive ones, but as ones where I can put what I know about borderline personality in this context. So there is positive appraisal style, there is positive reappraisal, and there is interference inhibition. So what we see in individuals with borderline personality disorder is the incapacity because of limited capacity to mentalize, to exercise, to use mentalizing in a regulative way, to appraise processes in the direction of reducing the stressfulness of the experience. They interpret experience, it actually drives up the experience of stress. And they have limited capacities for that kind of appraisal because of the absence of capacity to reorganize. But it's not just appraisal, but it's reappraisal, that is looking back on an experience that you've had to reinterpret that experience, to take a perspective on it that is so vulnerable to in borderline personality disorder, which, as I was trying to sell you, the story is the core to all personality disorder, because they have this specific deficit of being able to get away, and I think David described it really beautifully when he was talking about that you have a mental image and you have to be able to get away from that mental image. You have to be able to get away from the experience of yourself as being, shriveling in front of an audience with anxiety. If you have to be able to move away from that, to even if you had a traumatic time some years ago where you had actually completely collapsed. That is no use to you anymore. You have to, and in order to do that, you have to acquire the capacity, you have to have a good capacity for this higher order cognition, for this capacity to reorganize the systems that work, that come to the fore. I think John Gunderson and Carmen Lyons-Ruth's notion of interpersonal hypersensitivity and borderline personality fits into this kind of problem as well. That being able to move away from stressful interactions. And finally, I want to underscore the aspect of resilience that is to do with capacity to actually distract yourself, to inhibit something because you're looking at able to move somewhere else. And this is the inhibition of the re-traumatizing triggers, the threat-associated sensations is so characteristic of these individuals, and emotion dysregulation really is the consequence of this, I believe, not the cause, or not the, itself a core symptom. It's a consequence of an absence of resilience. And if you have an impairment of habituation, which is characteristic of these problems that we know, it actually may be a genetic predisposition. But the concept of alien self, which I don't have time to go into for those of you that know, that kind of looming and unmanageable anxiety incapable of the appraisal is part of this. Okay, I think at this point I will draw to a close, and thank you for being so attentive. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for a 10-minute discussion, roughly, and then we go to the research speech. Peter, what does that, how would you speculate about what it means developmentally? What's the age frame in which we can really build this resilience? When is it doomed?
Okay, it's an incredibly important question, Sarah. I don't think I would, I have never ever been, and I shall never be, a member of the developmental determinists society. I think, though, that probably some of this capacity is inherited. So it's genetically fairly highly loaded. And we know that borderline personality disorders, all the personality disorders have about 50% variance that is genetic. Probably at a certain level, it interacts with the severity of the challenge, the adversity challenge. And the complexity of your question, the reason it's a question is beautiful, because I think adversity itself, would be my speculation, can undermine the development of the capacity to cope with adversity. Okay, so it's not that even though it's genetic, but the capacity, because, let me give you a simple clinical example. If you have a kid with oppositional defiant disorder, and they constantly badly behave towards their parent, that parent who could give them the capacity, okay, to actually learn to reorganize their brains from within, then they will develop a vulnerability because of that early predisposition. Okay, so there is, as indeed there's good evidence, that what predicts future happiness is emotional, stability in the early years. So I think there is an accentuation of the early years. But some of that is because of a positive feedback cycle and doesn't reflect necessarily the inflexibility of the brain, which people sometimes attribute it to. So I'm not pessimistic about, if you look at the kind of evidence that David brings to it, what it shows is that even an adult brain like mine is capable of reorganizing itself, even though it doesn't know which bits of my brain function are going to be lost to Alzheimer's disease. My fibers are getting tangled by the day, and yet I'm able to present myself as not somebody who's clinically, as yet, suffering from Alzheimer's disease, because I'm reorganizing it. So the early influence, I think, is indeed, did you undermine your social environment undermine the capacity to develop that resilience function? So do you see what I'm getting at? So it's not an innocent process. It's not that it's either, it is as social as Jane was saying in his presentation. It's something that occurs in a social context because evolutionarily, I would say, the reason for it is in order to be able to equip the human being to cope with changing environmental circumstances, is the evolutionary origin of this higher order cognition.
And if I may react on the importance of the social environment or social structure, in a way to kind of rebuke your comment on Jacques Lacan's first article was about the family structure and how important family structure was. Naturally, that's the point. I totally agree. And there is, of course, a lot of things that perhaps we should integrate in our thinking, and we probably do so by going back to the old Palo Alto school. Yes. I mean, Paul Václavic delegates that thing to say. And I think also that Henriet, in a French psychiatric transition, Henriet was the person who was trying to integrate all of that, was a very important model.
I'll hold it for longer if you want.
So that makes me look good.
Other questions for Peter?
May I ask a question? It's actually a real question. So, at some point in your talk, you mentioned the G factor. That was not the G factor of general intelligence, was it?
No.
Okay, so here is my question. What is the correlation or the relationship between the P factor and the G factor of general intelligence?
Very poor.
Very poor.
Very poor. Because that's really the interesting thing. As I didn't have time to go into it, but actually educational attainment somewhat relates to it, but independently. In our study, you can control G of general intelligence, and you get the same association between this overarching, effectively the number of symptoms that you have, the total number of symptoms, and educational performance.
So being smarter doesn't necessarily help being more resilient?
There is good evidence that being smarter helps some. It just, I think there are, it gets us to really quite complicated territory, but I would say there is good evidence that being smarter gets you into social contexts that will actually generate better social relationships for you.
I can buy that.
Yeah, it's being smarter sitting on your own doesn't buy you a whole lot, if you see what I mean.
Unhappy consciousness of the philosopher in the armchair.
We've got some very interesting attachment data that shows that being securely attached actually is associated with being smarter. And yet being securely attached is predicted entirely by your environmental circumstances. So it's not as intelligence as this. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you again for your presentation.